Our webinar topic today is presented by Deborah Luke. It's called Do Something Beautiful for God, Reconciling the Artist's Intuition with the Needs of Liturgical Communities. Deborah Luke is a liturgical sculptor from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She studied sculpture at Dominican College in New Orleans with Angela Gregory in the early 70s. After many years doing portrait sculpture, she began sculpting images of Jesus and Mary, which led to a first church commission in 2000, providing Stations of the Cross. Deborah works in clay and casts her final work primarily in hydrostone and bronze. I'm very pleased to welcome Deborah, one of our members, to the webinar series. Welcome, Deborah. We're glad to have you with us.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for the introduction. I'll begin my talk today with one of my favorite quotes from Mother Teresa. Do something beautiful for God. And I think you will agree that the artist who created this marble sculpture in St. Peter's certainly fulfilled Mother Teresa's missive in a profound and lasting way. Michelangelo's work has inspired me for years, and it was during a trip to Italy in 1996 that the impact of his work and the work of so many Italian Renaissance artists left an indelible impression on me. I had been doing mostly portrait sculpture for 20 years prior to that trip. But when I returned, I had a new muse in the form of art celebrating the sacred, particularly Jesus and his mother. After my first sighting of the Pietà in St. Peter's, the next day I visited the Vatican Museum down the street and came across this book of black and white photographs taken of the sculpture when it was shipped to the United States in 1964 for the World's Fair. The book was a revelation. The photographs were taken by Robert Hupka, who had access to the sculpture when it was shipped. He was in the fortunate position of photographing it from angles never before seen. The book is filled with the most exquisite images like this one, and taken in total, it is like a blueprint for a sculptor. When I returned home, I shamelessly did my own small clay version, and you see it here cast in plaster. I share it with you now, not with any pride of accomplishment. Artists, after all, seek to be original. And how many little copies of the Pietà have been cast over the centuries? They are like mushrooms on the streets surrounding St. Peter's and in gift shops all over the world. My reason for sharing it will, I trust, become obvious as I tell you a story, the story of one particular commission I received in 2011. This story illustrates many of the joys and the challenges inherent in the work I have undertaken as a sculptor in the field of liturgical art. Hopefully, some part of this story will be of interest and perhaps instruction to those of you also working in this field. Many of you know Marquita Mock. She called me one day and told me that Brother Martin High School in New Orleans was building a new chapel on their campus in memory of a student who had died while there in the 70s. They were interested in my Stations of the Cross. This part of the work was simple and straightforward. The stations, one of which you see here on your screen, was originally commissioned for a church in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. Father Mark Joseph Costello was the design consultant on the church, Holy Family Catholic Community. The heavy lifting was already done. I had molds for these, and I was happy to cast another set in hydrostone. This is another image of a station in the church in Fond du Lac. While at Brother Martin with Marquita for an initial meeting, I learned that the school was also in need of two life-size freestanding sculptures. The first, a Holy Family, and the second, what they called a teaching Christ. I left the meeting excited by the prospect of two new original works of sculpture. I had seen the very contemporary plans for the chapel, which is in the shape of a diamond. The two freestanding sculptures in the round would be situated in alcoves opposite each other in the sides of the chapel. The altar was at the top of the diamond, the narthex at the bottom. I went home to begin work on maquettes. I turned to scripture for inspiration and immediately was seized by an image from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verses 41 to 52, the finding in the temple. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this story. It's the story of when Mary and Joseph took Jesus to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover, and they returned only to find on the journey that Jesus wasn't with them. He was 12 years old at the time, and he was still in Jerusalem. So they searched for him for 3 days, and they found him in the temple teaching and questioning the wise priests there. And I know you've heard the phrase, the scripture phrase, when Mary questioned Jesus about why he did this to them. He said, "Didn't you know I must be in my Father's house?" So I had my image. Since this was a boys' high school, I thought, what could be more perfect than the image of a 12-year-old Jesus metaphorically turning the tables upside down and teaching the elders? Wouldn't this resonate with the students? Wouldn't this be a beautiful way of answering both needs for a Holy Family sculpture and a teaching Christ? I imagined a sculpture of Joseph and Mary in one alcove, and that's the maquette you're looking at here. Mary leaning against Joseph, Joseph leaning against the column in the synagogue, both of them exhausted but relieved at the sight of the 12-year-old Jesus. And opposite them, Jesus and the old men sitting in rapt attention. I made maquettes, which you see here. Filled with excitement, I returned to New Orleans with Marquita, there to share the small clay models and my ideas with the committee. They were not impressed. The members insisted that the donors, who had given substantial funds for construction of the chapel, wanted a traditional Holy Family sculpture, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, and a separate Teaching Christ sculpture. They left the Holy Family for me to work out. For the Teaching Jesus, they handed me this image. It is a sculpture which sits outside of the Brothers of the Sacred Heart's mother house in Lyon, France. They told me, this is what we want you to do. Well, wounded but not defeated, I took my clay models in my pride and returned to my studio in Baton Rouge. Okay, they want a traditional Holy Family. They want an adult Christ with arms outstretched. I can do this, but I cannot succeed without inspiration. So for the Holy Family piece, I turned to the Pietà. I wanted this Holy Family in one sense to be a meditation on that work. I sensed that in spite of the very contemporary architecture of the church, the committee was wedded to the traditional in its desire for the art. So I made this little clay maquette with a seated Mary, a baby Jesus draped across her lap, and Joseph standing soldier-like behind her. The committee approved the maquette, with the exception of the Star of David that I had drawn on Joseph's chest. What I saw as a teaching moment in Jewish history and symbolism, they found objectionable. So be it. As you're looking at your screen now, you see a bronze cast of the same maquette on your right. So, time to make the life-size sculpture. The day I set out to begin, my husband was clearing land on the lot next to my studio. He had cut down a tree. As I looked at the stump that remained behind, I envisioned Mary seated on it. I knew I didn't want Mary on the ground plane at Joseph's feet. I wanted her elevated slightly. The stump was perfect. Its solidity and texture appealed to me greatly, and I knew it would echo the branches I had used in making the cross forms in the Stations of the Cross. After incorporating the trunk, but early in the work, I discovered that in masterworks of the past, Mary is often depicted at the top of the tree of life. Another nod to tradition, however subtle. I continued to work on the three figures, keeping in mind always the Pietà. Here are two faces of Mary, one a great deal more familiar than the other. If you haven't guessed, my own is on the right. And here you see that the arrangement of forefinger, cloth, and middle finger of the baby's hand in my sculpture is modeled on Christ's hand in the Pietà. Toward the end of my work on this piece, this verse from Isaiah suggested itself to me. A shoot shall sprout from the stump of Jesse, and from its roots a bud shall blossom. These words embellish the base of the sculpture, and you can see the clay work here with twigs used to form the letters. But to go back just a bit, early in the work, I read the following from The Eternal Woman by Gertrude von Lefort. The form of the mother is not sharply outlined, but flows into the form of the child. It is only Christianity that carried the form of mother and child into sculpture, but in its sacred character. The Madonna is the bearer of the divine, the torch, as it were, that carries the light of the world. She is the pedestal of the child, not a purpose in herself. These thoughts, along with St. Luke's reference to Mary as one who pondered things deeply in her heart, informed my image of Mary. Her eyes are gently closed as in prayer. Her hands do not clutch at the child, but rest on her knees. Her head is just slightly bowed. For a moment she is recollected, at peace, that peace which passeth understanding. And this, the image you're looking at here, is the full-scale bronze in the chapel. And Joseph. Matthew refers to Joseph as an upright man. A later reference in Matthew has some of Jesus' contemporaries referring to him as the carpenter's son. We do not know very much about Joseph. He is the silent figure in the Christian drama. What we do know is that he was a man who listened to his dreams and followed what he believed to be messages from God. For this reason, I believe that he too, like Mary, must have pondered things deeply in his own heart. This aspect of Joseph I tried to reflect in his face. His hands are the hands of a carpenter, and they are placed on Mary's shoulders. He remains behind her in support of both her and her child. And finally, the sparrow. How did a sparrow enter this composition? Well, early one morning, as I studied the clay, nearly satisfied with the work, a baby sparrow flew into my studio and landed on the base of the sculpture. It flew onto Mary's head and then onto Joseph's shoulder. It rested there for a long time, joining me in my meditation. I later read this in a book on symbolism in Christian art. Considered to be the lowliest among all birds, the sparrow came to be used as a symbol of the lowly, the least among all people, who were nevertheless under the protection of God the Father. For even the sparrow came to earth through the will of God, and received from him the means of life. The beautiful words of Mary's Magnificat are called to mind here, prompted by the visit from a sparrow. My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior, for he has looked down upon the lowliness of his handmaid. Behold, from now on, all ages will call me blessed. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him. For the Teaching Christ sculpture, I searched sacred scripture for guidance. I was drawn once again to Luke's gospel at the beginning of his ministry in Galilee. Luke reports that Jesus had been teaching in the synagogues, quote, in the power of the Spirit. We read that he was handed a scroll of the prophet Isaiah. He unrolls the scroll and in effect paraphrases Isaiah's prophecy about the one who is to come. He begins with the words, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." Curiously, I discovered that this very passage in Isaiah is the next verse following the stump of Jesse verse. The use of these two verses seemed to me a beautiful way to connect the Holy Family and the Teaching Jesus sculptures, which would face each other across the new chapel. Here's the small clay maquette, which was approved by the committee. And here's the full-scale clay in my studio. And some details. The feet of Christ. Jesus' left foot is planted firmly on the base of the sculpture. His right foot extends beyond the edge of the base, symbolic of his eagerness to enter our physical world. The hands of Christ. In meditating on Christ's hands, I see his right hand as welcoming, his left hand as teaching. Before we can learn from Christ, we must come to Christ. Jesus does not command, he invites. Once we respond to the invitation, then we begin to learn. And the face of Christ. In sculpting Christ's face, I tried to express the beauty and the love that must have been reflected in the human face of Jesus. Now looking at him, I see also a sense of urgency, a holy desire to reach us with his love and care. It is as if he is saying, "Come to me, all you who labor and are burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart, and you will find rest for yourselves, for my yoke is easy and my burden light." And this is the full-scale bronze in the chapel. As you look at the Teaching Jesus, I will share with you the most important lesson I learned during the project. It may sound trite, but I think I had to learn the value of letting go. I had to let go of my initial excitement and conviction and move in a direction that the community wanted. For me, this story illustrates perhaps the greatest challenge that we as liturgical artists often face: how to be true to our own primary calling as artists, while at the same time respecting the wishes of so many other voices involved in the process of building and furnishing churches. I think I learned that if we stay rooted in truth, the truth of sacred scripture, and the truth of our own calling as artists, we can follow Mother Teresa's command to do something beautiful for God. It's been 8 years since I completed the work for the Brother Martin community. In the time remaining before discussion, I'd like now to share a few of the projects I've undertaken since then. In 2013, I received a call from the Franciscan Renewal Center in Phoenix, Arizona, the Phoenix area, Scottsdale. And I was asked if I would consider working on 2 separate relief sculptures. The first would celebrate the Incarnation, depict the Incarnation, and would be situated in the inside of the church. And the second is a depiction of the Resurrection, which would be situated on an exterior wall, stone wall of the church. So I have to say about this particular project, it was the most well-planned project I've ever been fortunate to be a part of. All of the art was planned in conjunction with the architectural design work. This, what you're looking at here, is a maquette of the Incarnation. The committee made it very clear to me that they wanted a sort of a traditional nativity depiction, because it is a Franciscan institution and they were honoring the fact that Francis was the first person to set up a nativity. His desire was that everyone should appreciate the poverty into which Jesus was born. And so they specifically wanted the ox and the ass. And I had the idea to make it a triptych arrangement and include the shepherds on one of the side panels and the wise men on the other side panel. And this is the actual finished work, full scale, installed on an interior wall of the church. This particular image illustrates one point I'd like to make about lighting. Relief sculpture needs just the right kind of light in order to be appreciated fully. And to me, this was the most beautiful arrangement of light and art that I've ever been a part of. This is the product, the cast material is a product called 4-ton MG. It's a modified gypsum product that is lighter in weight than hydrostone, which I often cast in, and it's much more durable. And not that hydrostone's not durable, but for larger scale pieces, it's much lighter and just much more manageable to work with. It's reinforced with fiberglass. Now, for the resurrection image, once again, I searched for inspiration and I turned to a piece I had done about 20 years ago when I was doing a series based on the Gospel of John. And this particular image came from John chapter 1, verse 51. It always evoked the resurrection to me. It's when Jesus told Nathanael, "You will see greater things than this. You will see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man." So I naturally turned to this image, similar to the way I returned to the Pieta for the Holy Family work. But I wanted to somehow include the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. So I planned another triptych. And this is the maquette, the small maquette I prepared for the resurrection. As you can see, the scenes on the side panels are Mary Magdalene and Christ in the garden in the upper left. Then Christ on the road to Emmaus in the middle, and below, Thomas and Jesus. On the right panel, you'll see Peter with the haul of fish, and then breakfast at the Sea of Tiberias in the center, and finally at the bottom, John and Jesus, when Jesus asks John 3 times, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And then finally, "Feed my lambs." So as you'll see, this is the maquette, and next you will see that it is no longer a maquette. I'm sorry, it's no longer a maquette, and it's no longer a triptych. In doing the large-scale model, I started with the figure of Christ, and I was so pleased with the face and the whole figure that I realized that the hands, if it were a triptych, Christ's hands would not fit in the middle panel. So rather than redo the whole thing and make Christ much smaller, I went to the committee and said, "Look, I think it works best as a single relief." And fortunately, they agreed with me. And so what was originally intended as a triptych, became one large panel. What you're looking at here is the clay model in my studio. And the next image is the bronze cast. It's freshly cast. If you know anything about bronze sculpture, this is what bronze looks like prior to patina, prior to the finish. And this is the installed piece on a wall of the exterior wall of the church. The color is really off here. It's not that bluish. This is more what it really looks like. This is an image of the exterior of the church, obviously. And another image. And another project that I want to discuss very briefly is here in Baton Rouge. We just built a brand new children's hospital in our town. We hadn't had a freestanding children's hospital up until this year. And I was asked to design 3 large reliefs that would be inset into alcoves in a hall leading to the chapel. And I was told that each floor of the hospital had a particular theme, and the themes were Louisiana environments. So my husband and I have spent a lot of hours and days kayaking on Louisiana rivers. So I immediately had the image of St. Francis in a pirogue, because the Franciscan missionaries of Our Lady are the administrators of the hospital. And a pirogue, if you're not familiar with Louisiana terms, is a small boat. And that was my initial idea, was St. Francis in a pirogue surrounded by cypress trees and all the native animals and plants common to Louisiana. Well, the imagery grew from that initial idea to include Christ and 3 children, and eventually Mary at the top of a tree of life. And this is installed in the hospital. This illustrates what I'm saying about lighting. This lighting is okay, but it's not perfect, because it's sort of harsh. It does show up the figures, but as you can see in this particular image, I feel that if the light were just a little bit farther forward, some of the subtleties in the face of Christ and the children would be better appreciated. And this is the 3rd panel. And the last project I want to talk about just briefly is one that is still underway. It's Christ Victorious. It's an 8-foot crucifix intended for the Maryland province of the Jesuits in Philadelphia. They're building a new residence house and a brand new church or chapel, which will be attached to the residence house, but not freestanding, just separate, of course, from it, but it's a combination of a residence house and chapel. At any rate, many years ago, I had done a 3-foot bronze that I called Christ Victorious, and that's what you're looking at in this image. It's as I said, 3 feet tall, and in this particular image, Christ and the cross become one. And to me, it symbolizes Christ's victory over death, over the cross. At any rate, this particular image is what Father Bob Hussey requested that I do, but enlarged to 8 foot. Now, I'm not a fan of mechanical enlargements. If I'm going to do an 8-foot crucifix, it's going to be a brand new crucifix. And I emphasize the fact that it wouldn't be exactly like this. And so this next slide is an image of the clay in my studio of the 8-foot Christ Victorious. And I searched and searched for just the right piece of wood to model the figure on. What you see here, other than my husband and off to the right, is the structure that he had to build for me to put the cross, the wood, and the clay on so that I could model it. That is not part of the sculpture, that background support. The wood that I found had just a perfect curve for the sculpture as I envisioned it. And these are some more images of the clay of the Christ Victorious. And the bronze cast, it will be a solid bronze cast, including the tree form there that you see will be part of the bronze sculpture, of course. And Christ is seen to be embracing the cross with his hands. And that's the last image I have of the finished works. And I have a few nuts and bolts images here to share with you, just in the interest of showing that the finished work doesn't just materialize miraculously. And this messy image that you're looking at is actually the armature that we used for the Holy Family sculpture. You can get a glimpse there of the stump that's holding up those foam boards that are all glued together. We had decided that were I to do a solid clay 5-foot 3-inch sculpture, it would have weighed 1,000 pounds. So we made a core. Many sculptors use this technique, a foam core rather than a wire armature. And then, so we stacked those pieces of foam, and then I carved them in the approximate shape and proportion that the figure would be in. I also did some grinding to get down some of those surfaces. And the image you see here is, I've started adding clay, obviously, to the foam. This image is the first coat of rubber applied to the sculpture, the finished clay sculpture. And if you know anything about mold making, this is rather tedious and long a process. Each section has to be made a mold of. What I'm doing here, over the yellow, the rubber, I'm applying plastic, which is a rigid form, which holds the rubber in place so that an accurate wax can be taken from it. Here you see it almost completed, all the different sections. And the back of the sculpture. And this is the wax cast. I actually made the wax here in my studio after I made the molds, made the wax cast and had to bring it to Dallas, Texas for casting. These are more mold making pictures. As you can see, this is the Christ Victorious sculpture. And that yellow edge you see is the rubber mold along the perimeter. I did the face of the sculpture first. My husband had to build a support because he was very fearful that when we went to move the sculpture from its stand to the ground, it might warp. So he built this framework underneath it that supports the sculpture while the mold is being made. I'm removing here a clay shim or wall that's used to make the edge of the mold. And here's another view of it with most of it done, just a few pieces remaining to complete the work. And that concludes my remarks. I'd be happy to entertain any questions or comments that anyone might have regarding the work. I'm very grateful for the opportunity of sharing this with all of you.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for your presentation. And I've got to say, starting out, that first Madonna that you showed has the sweetest face I think that I've seen on a Madonna. Just lovely.
Thank you.
So peaceful and lovely. So we'll be able to entertain questions. I am going to turn on the microphone of Marilyn Morgan too. Marilyn knows Deborah well and is one of our committee members. And so if Marilyn, if you have any questions you'd like to ask as well, we'd be happy to hear them. I do have, I would like to hear a little more about your, when you describe kind of reconciling the artist's vision with what the liturgical communities need. You seem to me, at least the way that you've described some of your processes, to be very accommodating to the desires of clients. I know there is always a tension between artist or architect and client, and sometimes that's a really good thing. How do you go about resolving those differences, and how much do you press for what you see as your vision when that is not necessarily completely in line with what somebody is asking you to do?
Right. Well, every project I've been on has been different because everybody that you deal with is different. And sometimes people are flexible and in my view, reasonable, and they're open to the inspirations that the artist has had. And other times, there was one case in particular where the client just had the feeling because I do want to address this one point. A maquette is an approximation of what the larger piece will be. And when you go from a small piece to a much larger piece, changes are inevitable. And I try to explain that to the client up front, that what you see in this maquette is not exactly what it's going to be when it's large, because it's not, like I said, a mechanical reproduction. So I think part of it can be resolved with education, and being willing to listen to the other side. But sometimes people have the feeling that the changes that you've made or somehow you're pulling something over on them, when really that's not the case. So I think the ability to listen is important, and the ability to be somewhat flexible. I've never been in a situation that we just couldn't resolve, frankly, where I just threw up my hands. But I think if people could understand more about the art process, many priests and people who are on the receiving end of this work have no appreciation for the artistic process and what it involves and how it works. And, if you're just patient and you listen and you express yourself in a calm, clear manner, sometimes that's the way to work these things out.
Thank you. We have a question from Carol Frenning, who's asking, Carol is one of our liturgical consultants, and she's asking, what was the role of a liturgical consultant in your work with faith communities? In other words, how do you interact, or how have you found opportunity to interact with liturgical consultants? You mentioned Mark Joseph Costello, and I'd be interested in hearing more about your work with the consultant.
Right. Well, mainly the consultant, depending on their relationship with the church they're working for, I've found them to be mainly a go-between, a reference. They haven't really been I don't know how to put this, an integral part in the work. It's more of just a reference, to be honest. Sometimes they interpret the wishes. I'm thinking of Sister Marilyn. There was one project where I had done a full-scale Holy Family, which was in relief. And I know she came to me and said, well, they like it, but they want Joseph to look more Middle Eastern. I guess he looked too Western. And so that was fine, and I loved reworking Joseph's face. So sometimes the liturgical design consultant can be a go-between and almost like a negotiator. But many times it seems that they're there mainly to give your name to the organization that they're working for, and then at that point, they kind of hand it over to you.
Great, and I'm curious, kind of as a follow-up. I have an architectural background, and I'm also curious about how much interaction you find. A lot of cases, the artist comes after the architect is complete or the architecture is complete, and but have you had opportunity of working with an architectural setting as it's being created?
Only in that project I mentioned in Phoenix.
The wall, right?
Yes, where the architects and the artists, and this was mainly at the urging of the committee, the community there. They wanted the art and the architecture to work together beautifully, and so they insisted on it. And so, but I haven't had much direct contact with architects on these projects. And I know I'm thinking back to the Brother Martin work. And I know I remember in one committee meeting, the architect kind of was with me, but he got outvoted by the school and their desires. But so, I've never really worked in depth, I have to say, with an architect. Unfortunately, a lot of the times my work is asked for after the plans are made. And
Right, that's generally my experience with a lot of projects.
yes, and that is just not ideal. It's not the ideal. The ideal would be to incorporate both from the get-go, as they say, from the beginning.
So we have a question from Gilbert Sungera, who's both a liturgical consultant and also has practiced as an architect. And he's asking, with the relief work, do you find more texture on the surrounding walls helpful or harmful, especially with the lighting system, such as in the Arizona piece?
Yeah, I find a textured wall is beautiful because my particular reliefs are fairly simple and plain, and there's a lot of empty space. And where my reliefs are set in next to, adjacent to stone, have always been my preference. Highly textured stone, not like polished marble, but those, the rough stone you saw in the both in the Holy Family in Fond du Lac and the Franciscan Renewal Center in Phoenix. I love the complement, the stone and the relief work, whether it's bronze or hydrostone.
I'm kind of curious, since Gilbert had mentioned the lighting, the pieces that had that harsh light, was that in place before your reliefs were added, or was that something that was done kind of in conjunction? Seems like less skill in appropriately lighting or
Yes.
the actual relief.
Actually, the alcoves were built and the fixture was in place.
Okay.
So, it's funny. When I started work on it, my husband set up lighting almost identical to what we knew existed. This one spot almost directly over the piece. But when it went from my studio has a lot of light. It has skylight and it has a lot of ambient light. And so when it went from my studio to the hospital, it was a bit of a disappointment because of the harshness of the light. And I think it could be remedied by just pulling the light, moving that fixture and pulling it farther forward so that it's not directly over the heads of the figures in the sculpture. So unfortunately, that was, that the lighting was set before any consideration. I never talked to an architect on that project.
So Greg Lewis, kind of one of our members, is also asking, or asked in his question about your experience working with architects and interior designers, and we've kind of covered that. He's also asking, what kind of timeline do you typically work with?
Well, that there again, it depends on the project. The Brother Martin work was incredibly compressed. They contacted me in February and the church was dedicated in November. And so I had to do all that work in, 10 months. Usually it's more flexible than that. Like the Franciscan Renewal Center, that was a period of 3 years. So again, every project has been different, and time hasn't been a terrible constraint in my work. I've often, felt that I've had enough time to devote to each project. So
And then
it
Greg,
really,
go ahead.
it hasn't been, it hasn't been a stumbling block. But I would like to, can we go back to the lighting
Sure.
situation? There's one project that I was consulted. Mark Joseph was the consultant on this too, but the plans for the church were already in place. In fact, the church was just about built before they called me with the stations. And I did a set of stations which they loved, but they installed them. They're actually horizontal in format, and there is no lighting. And so in the reliefs that are kind of there, although they're high relief, there's just not enough light. And so they were not happy with that. And I pushed them to do something about the lighting, but they just didn't want to make any changes to the church. So the reliefs are very high up and there isn't adequate lighting. So, it's not the ideal, certainly in that case.
And so then Greg was,
I think that's St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
So Greg was also asking about what is your experience with budget negotiations?
I've had good, I've had success. I don't think anybody's ever said, no, that's not within the budget. So I'm I don't have a high overhead, and I think people have generally been pleased with the budget numbers that I've put forward.
Great. And I want to just say too, Greg Lewis, in asking these questions, he sent along his compliments on your talents and says your use of textured composition and your freedom to express it. So appreciative of your work.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Marilyn, I think you had a comment that you wanted to make.
Yes, in Debbie's work on the Holy Family, I just wanted to point out the texture that she used on the clothing. The committee had asked for it to be like authentic Arab clothing, and what turned out was that it very welcoming to people who are visually impaired. We have another one of her Holy Family at our retirement place, and the sisters who are visually impaired come up and touch it, and so it's a really good tactile thing, just in general, with the clothing. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that when you asked for, when the committee asked for the older teacher, Jesus the teacher, I was wondering if there was a conversation between you and the owners about, you had envisioned the 12-year-old Christ, and they had shown a statue of a much older person. And what I think you did was compromise, basically. But did you have a discussion about the age at all?
We didn't. They just wanted something that evoked that same posture and the adult Christ. I guess they did say, we just want something that looks a lot like this. The Brothers of the Sacred Heart are all about tradition and honoring the past. And I think they were, I don't know why they rejected my first idea, but we didn't really talk at length about the age of Christ. We didn't. I came up with the maquette, and they said, go with that. So, yeah, we didn't really have an in-depth discussion about that.
Interesting.
Does that answer your question?
It does indeed. My other comment is, again, what Greg had said. I love the emotion that you portray in the faces. And I was wondering if you have asked your committees what point or what emotion they want to convey.
Well, You know, it's funny. I don't I don't like to ask those kinds of questions because I'm afraid I'm going to open a can of worms.
Mhm.
And now sometimes there was one project for a church in West Virginia, and my image of Mary has always been the contemplative part of Mary. And this particular project in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, they were also building a new church, and they wanted me to do a Marian devotional piece in relief. And I kept coming up with these maquettes that they kept rejecting of Mary in a contemplative pose. And they said, no, 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 we want her at the wedding at Cana where she is initiating Jesus's action. We want her in an active role. We want the active Mary. So I can't tell you how hard it was for me to answer that. But eventually I did. I kept doing maquettes. And finally they saw one, they said, that's it, that's the one we want. So, you know, that's a case where it's really challenging. That was terribly challenging because I just, you know, Mary to me is just someone different from what they wanted to say. You know, they wanted an activist, and I just don't see Mary as an activist in the sense that contemporary activism is understood. You know, I guess she was in a sense an activist, but it was a real hard thing for me to do. But eventually, you know, it worked out, and they were pleased with the work, and I am too. So I've never had to do anything that at the end I said, I don't like this. You know, I have to be pleased with it in order
Absolutely.
for me to present it.
Mhm.
So,
It's beautiful.
Deborah, I was really glad that you incorporated some images of work in progress. I think sometimes we see the finished results,
yeah,
and they're so beautiful and they look so effortless. and we aren't always appreciative of all of the things that artists have to go through in order to get that end result. Things like building the support systems, and I was fascinated by the foam. It's something that I think probably if I thought about it, I would be aware of how heavy clay could be, but
yeah.
um, just seeing how you solve that type of issue brings a different level of appreciation for the work of the artist.
Right. Oh, well, thank you, Paul. And I have you to thank for doing that because, you know, in our practice session, I didn't have any nuts and bolts pictures. And so you prompted that. And I'm so glad that I added those at the end.
Well, and the whole process of creating the mold is an art in itself,
Yeah.
um, and very labor intensive.
Yes, extremely. Yeah, I'm lucky I have married a man who is very hands-on, and he worked in heavy construction his whole career, and so he loves making things, and he's been my right-hand man through all of this when it comes to the left brain work, which making molds it is an art, but it's also left brain. So uh, I've been very lucky with that.
So Gilbert Singera has another question asking, what are the challenges that you have to deal with exterior application, both from the standpoint of how that affects materials and how that affects the composition, and he also says a great series of image uh, finished and processed.
Uh, yes, you know, for the most part, bronze is the preferred material for exterior sculptures. It's just, you know, it's for the ages. And of course, stone too, but I don't carve directly in stone. I have in years past, but I haven't with regard to the sacred art. Um, so really, bronze is the only material I've worked with for exterior applications. And does that answer his question?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, certainly outdoor applications would have to be weatherproof and
Right.
and may be affected then by patina issues as well. Do you, in fact, Gilbert just asked, do you have to use special coatings? And I was going to ask the same thing about how you either preserve or not the finish that you want on the piece.
Yes, but patina, the patinas for exterior use they're largely the same in terms of the chemicals that are used to, darken the bronze. But they are sprayed with a lacquer, a thin coat of lacquer, and then polished. And there's a lot of controversy about the types of lacquers, and I tend to prefer a very matte lacquer. I don't like when you see a bronze cleaned and repatinaed, that shininess. It just doesn't look authentic to me. It has a plastic look to it. So I prefer like a matte lacquer. Now, there are other products on the market other than bronze, cast bronze. For instance, there's a product called 4-ton MG. If you want a light colored piece of art in an exterior setting, and they claim that if it's sealed properly, with a good sealer, like a concrete sealer, that will withstand the weather over time. But I prefer to work with bronze if in an exterior setting, unless somebody just really wants something light in color. But now bronze patinas are all different colors now. They can a good patineur can make a bronze just about any color he wants, including making it look like marble. I don't know if y'all are familiar with the art of patina at this point in time, but it's really progressed over the years to include various looks.
So we are just about out of time. I want to thank you, Deborah, for your presentation and for your art. And thank you for agreeing to present to us. And we look forward to having you involved in webinars in the future, I'm sure.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's been a real joy for me to pull all these images together and to share them with you. I'm very grateful.